Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Page One podcast. I'm Tarek.
I'm Marco, and thanks for tuning in. And welcome back, Tarek.
What do you mean?
As I told everyone last week, you've been jet-setting around the world. So
Last week? You did the podcast without me?
No, maybe.
Yes, unfortunately I did miss last week. I was off to Nashville, the country music city.
Performing.
I was on the Opry.
Brilliant. Excellent. When's the record out?
I was told to get out and to stop singing when they'd obviously closed up for the night.
Well, good to have you back.
Thank you. Glad to be back, obviously.
Listeners will maybe agree.
I'm sure they missed me last week.
Yeah.
But anyway, who's on this week, Marco?
This week we have our very first video game writer, Ian Dallas, who's the creative director of a studio called Giant Sparrow.
Yeah.
They've created games, lesser known games perhaps, to people that don't play a lot of games. Unfinished Swan, which is a giant paintball game.
Yes, a kind of abstract.
Yeah, very abstract concept and game, but also really unique and interesting.
Absolutely.
And What Remains of Edith Finch is their other famous, I would say more famous one. And both of those games won BAFTA awards.
Yes.
In fact, I think What Remains of Edith Finch won Game of the Year.
I think that's right. It is against quite a lot of stiff competition.
Yeah.
But rightly so, because it is a fantastic piece of work.
Oh, no, it is. And now I know a lot of our listeners tune in because they want to hear authors talking about the writing, or screenwriters or comic writers. And you might not be into video games, which is totally fine, because I would still encourage you to listen to this episode, because Ian was a really interesting guy to speak to.
Yeah.
Had a lot to say about the storytelling process and how he writes for video games.
Yeah.
Some of those techniques apply across the board, I think.
Yeah.
And the thing about the games that he creates is that they're not the sort of stereotypical shoot 'em up.
They're not your Grand Theft Autos or your Halos.
No, and some of those games can have great stories as
Oh
well.
yeah, of course.
Great
But this is it's almost like an interactive story or film or something, isn't it? Yeah,
it is. Although I think what's unique is that I don't think that these stories, you could tell these stories in a different medium. You could tell them as a book, a series of short stories, in the case of What Remains of Edith Finch, or a film, but it wouldn't be as impactful because you don't have that interactivity. And I think, as we discussed on the podcast, that interactivity really makes a massive difference.
So I really hope that people do enjoy this episode, because I think, as you say, games are a genre which is often overlooked in terms of its storytelling, and I think that's something that would be nice to change going forward, because the writing in games can be just as good as some of the best writing in books and films.
And actually, sometimes it's the things you have to think about as a writer in games, as Ian will go on to say. It presents new challenges for you, definitely. And the other thing to mention is you may hear traffic noises in the background.
That's right.
Because
Ian is the fittest man on the planet.
Because we probably sounded more out of breath than him. And he was cycling throughout the whole time he was speaking to us on this podcast. Yeah. So anyway, we're rambling on too much now. We'll be back at the end of the podcast to discuss it a bit more. But in the meantime, I hope you enjoyed the chat with Ian.
See you later.
Was it getting into video games that you wanted to, was that your goal rather than to write in some other area?
My initial goal was to be a writer for video games.
Okay.
Guys, going way back, starting in college, I thought that I was going to be a philosophy professor. And then I thought, maybe I'll be an English professor. And then I was working as a comedy writer on the college humor magazine, and had an epiphany that I really just like hanging out with other writers, and that felt like more, my people. And I'd had some pretty powerful experiences growing up with video games, and I thought, maybe I can write for video games. But when I was graduating from college in 2000, there really weren't a lot of game writing jobs. It wasn't a career path. And so my thought was, video games are, evolving all the time. I will spend, the next 5 or 10 years writing for television and film, and then eventually transition to video games. So I moved to Los Angeles and started working as a super low level assistant basically on some TV shows, and eventually worked my way up to the baby writer, and realized that in video games, after a few years and learning a little bit more about the industry, that writing for video games was not actually a job that seemed that interesting to me.
Yeah.
I feel like it's often your role on a team as a writer to put lipstick on the pig, to take something that someone else has already created, and then at the last hour you come in and, sort of finesse things and try to smooth over the worst offenses. And so then I decided that instead of writing for video games, I would rather just make them from scratch. And so I went back to grad school and spent a few years learning how to program and 3D model and all that stuff, and then started making some prototypes, and was very fortunate that Sony saw one of those prototypes and suggested putting that together as a game and provided funding for that.
Was that the Unfinished Swan?
Yes, that was our first game, the Unfinished Swan, which came out in 2012.
And for people that don't know what the Unfinished Swan is, I think it's fair to say that people might have an idea of video games as, shooters or Grand Theft Auto or things like that. And your games are very, very different beasts. They're almost unique in the way that they tell their story. And it is a very sort of interactive storytelling almost, I would say. But the Unfinished Swan, I was saying do you want to tell me, how would you describe the Unfinished Swan?
That was my job for a few years, explaining what that was. Yeah, and it increasingly becomes part of my job as I make games that are, intentionally unlike things that people have experienced. That is what drives me, is creating new experiences. That's what motivates me in my regular life, and that's what I want to provide for players in these games. So the Unfinished Swan is a first-person painting game that takes place in an entirely white world, and the player is throwing paintballs to splatter the environment and reveal the world around them. And it makes a lot more sense if you see an animated GIF, a second or 2 frames. But in terms of audio, that's about the best I can do.
Yeah, no, and it's told from the perspective of, it is like almost a children's story about a child who's loved this painting that was unfinished, relating to his mother, and that sort of gets you into the story.
No, and the high-level goals for that game were evoking a sense of curiosity and wonder, and so we at a lot of children's books as inspiration and took some deliberate tonal influences from this.
And with a game like that, is there a planning of the sort of story arc, such as there is in that game, or does the concept of the game come to you first and then you work around that?
It's a little bit of both. For me, the thing that starts the development process is a feeling, some kernel of an experience that I've had that I would like to explore. And I look at things kind of as research projects, funding, me for a couple of years to think about something that is interesting to me. And all of the other pieces of the experience evolve gradually and often painfully from, just sort of trying things out and then adjusting when those plans don't work. And for Edith Finch, for example, that core experience that everything was built off of was scuba diving, and seeing the bottom of the ocean slope away into this infinite darkness and being in the presence of something that felt simultaneously beautiful and overwhelming, and trying to figure out how could we make a game that evoked those feelings. And that led to making a literal scuba diving prototype initially, and then looking at references similar to the Unfinished Swan, where, very early on, once the sort of core feeling has been identified, then I spend a lot of time reading books and watching movies and taking in any other form of culture that successfully evokes some of the feelings that I'm interested in, trying to learn from, what they're doing, and also just kind of like sort of wrap myself up in this feeling to make it easier to imagine what a game version of that might look like. And so then some of those references end up working their way into the game in a very practical way. Like in the case of Edith Finch, we ended up conceiving of the game or formatting it as a series of short stories, partly because a lot of the references, like weird fiction from Lovecraft to Borges, they're short stories generally. Mm-hmm. I think that there's a lot of reasons why that format works well for creating these kinds of overwhelming experiences, mostly because they're intense. And you can't really sustain that for a novel. It works a lot better when you have kind of a hard stop with the end of a short story that you can do that you can't really do as frequently in a novel. And you give people a chance to come down from that experience. So, you can bring them back up later.
Yeah.
And I think that's right. As I think the biggest thing that I took away from Edith Finch was, and for those who haven't played it, it's as you say, it's a woman who goes home to her house, to her old kind of family home, and experiences a bunch of short stories almost about her family members. And how did you plan, or how did you come up with the ideas for each member and the writing process for that? Because each one is so unique and different in its own way, but it tells its own incredible little story that adds up to this larger whole.
Yeah, in our case, the gameplay is usually what comes first, because that tends to be the hardest part of the process. So it's the thing that drives everything else. And so we'd have an experience like, for example, there's a story that takes place on a swing set. And we started by getting a very rough, playable prototype of what it might feel like to be on a swing set, and kind of worked backwards from that. And the story is something that evolves. I mean, it's partly there. Like, we know that you're going to be on a swing set. Yeah. So, for example, in that case, like, it makes sense that you would probably be a child. And we know a little bit about the world that you're in, because that's sort of already been determined. And so narratively, some of those things are already kind of in place, but we generally work backwards from, okay, what does this feel like for the player? And then make a story that supports that, or in some cases, runs a little bit counter to that. Like, if the story feels, kind of like it's in danger of being a little bit too goofy, then we might make something a little bit serious, or, vice versa. And we use the story, like, I think of the story as basically like curling, the sweeper that is out in front, that's brushing the ice away a little bit to, whatever the giant puck thing is called. And that's like, the puck in this case is the player's experience of the game and what the gameplay is doing. Like, it's this very powerful force that is difficult to adjust. And so the story is, out there, like, it's very easy to change lines of dialogue and to add new information or take it away. So in terms of its a hierarchy of game development, it's usually something that comes last, but, or later in the process, but that does have a significant impact on the player experience.
And is it as a team then that you would develop the story at that later stage, or I think your creative director, did you sort of take a first run at what the actual story would be once you had those constituent bits there, or did you work on that as a team?
As a creative director, I'm generally the one who's coming up with the original inspiration for all of these stories. And a lot of them gestate for a while internally, where I will, maybe write character bios and make prototypes and design little 3D scenes and start to kind of think about how these might work. Part of that is because I don't really know enough about it to, like, I just have these kind of vague tugs of like, I think, something on a swing set feels like it ties into some of the elements that this game is about, like the sense of childhood and memory and, sort of slight danger that's around us. And then to build off of that. So it tends to be fairly internal and on my shoulders for a while. And then once there's something that is working and that people can play, then it becomes much more collaborative. Mm-hmm. And we put it in front of like not only a team, but then also a lot of playtesters who come through, and then we hear their feedback, which is one of the very unusual aspects of making a game, that because it's interactive, like it's based on what the player is doing and what is in their head and how they're responding. It's hard to predict how that experience will take root for players. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it ends up being determined by factors that you can't be aware of when you're initially conceiving the story. Things like, how the scene is lit, where their eye goes to, or what you might have told the player 5 minutes before that in a story that happened previously that you haven't written yet. So you get all these things together, and then you realize why they might not be working, and you make mm-hmm. adjustments based on that. And so the story is one of those ways that we can fix problems or kind of massage things back and forth. And that becomes very collaborative.
And is trying to tell a narrative story via a game, I imagine it must be a lot harder because you're not got the person's attention on a screen or a book. They could be looking up or down or have the camera swung anyway. And how do you make sure that they see the right part of the story that's happening in front of them?
Yeah, the attention is an interesting problem because in some ways you have too much of their attention. Mm-hmm. It's just devoted to things you may not necessarily care about. In the worst case, it would be something that is frustrating or confusing. Like if they're in a room and you want them to pick up a book to progress the story along, maybe they don't see the book. And there's a lot of reasons why that might be. Other things in the room that are, drawing their attention. Also, we notice that players can get into these kind of vicious cycles where they get frustrated, and so then they kind of close up and stop experimenting. It's kind of like if you're under threat, it's very hard to try new things. To go for what's familiar. And so there's a constant balancing act that goes through the playtesting process of trying to smooth out some of these areas where the player's attention is directed at things that are not germane to what we're trying to tell them about. And of course, the players might be interested in other things. And so some of that is just listening to, like if we've told you about a character, for example, previously in a story, and then you're now in a room where there's a little bit more about that character. Maybe you're just drawn to that. And so, you aren't going to go to the area that we're kind of more interested in as game developers at this. And so the writing, for example, often has to work at its own pace where we don't it can be interrupted, or there could be long gaps between where we think that these two lines are going to play, within 10 seconds of each other. But actually, if players go this other way, maybe it could be 5 minutes. Yeah. And so a lot of that is just brute force playtesting, which is kind of a lovely aspect of the process that you don't have to get it right the first time, that you can look at 100 people go through an experience and start to get a sense of roughly where are people going to be drawn, and then what can we do to kind of encourage players to go one way or the other. So for example, in our game, there are little icons that appear over things that you can investigate. Mm-hmm. And so we might have one of those icons attuned so that it doesn't appear until after another icon, is activated first. And so people are less likely to go to the one versus the other. Or we might even put the same information in multiple places in the room so that you can trigger it, in a way that feels natural to you. Again, that's just, it's hard. It's impossible to know where the player's attention is going to be for the most part. But if you watch enough people play the game, you can find a lot of pretty reliable patterns. Yeah. And as a game developer, there are tricks to lead people subconsciously in a way that feels almost evil when you've done it enough times and people just kind of naturally, it's like watching, like balls falling in a pachinko game or something. They just like naturally tend to a certain order if you have arranged things in subtle ways, often with lighting and color cues or movement or, any number of tricks for game designers.
And have you, in that sort of playtesting process, has there ever been in the games that you've developed so far a situation where something's happened that you totally didn't, the players have done something that you just didn't expect at all, and you've had to make changes as a result of that?
Yeah, it's hard to remember like specific examples of that, but there are a lot of times I feel like where players will do something that is very unexpected for us, but once you see it, makes perfect sense. Like, oh, right. Mm-hmm. Like, of course, people might assume that that's how that works, even though, because we know so much more about the way that the system works and everything about the internals, we sort of have different assumptions. I think also players are coming from, in a game like Edith Finch that is dealing with some very personal topics, like parenthood and death, and those things play off of past histories on the part of the player that are hard for us to predict. Mm-hmm. One example, there's a story in Edith Finch that involves a young child taking a bath, and we had very different experiences from playtesters who were parents versus those who were not. And so that was an interesting bit of information that encouraged us to do a lot of playtesting with parents periodically, just to see how, they would react, to get a, better sense of what players might experience. And another thing that has been kind of impressive and a little frustrating is how differently people react to an experience that feels complete and that they have paid for. I probably watched 200 people play the game by the time that we released it, and I'm pretty sure not one tear was shed. Most of the people didn't enjoy it. Like, by the end, it was relatively friction-free, and I think people were very engaged by it, but nobody cried. It's just not something that people do in playtests. But after the game was released, we heard from any number of people who said that the game, was the first thing that had made them cry, or that they'd had this, very cathartic experience. And so it's another level of, even though you can watch people experience the final version of the game, when they play it in their own homes, that's different then. Yeah. And that's a hard thing to calibrate, although, our shorthand for that is just to get people drunk and to have them play a little bit of drinking and to have someone play the game with them. Yeah. I think when you have two people playing a game, that loosens up a lot of the tension. I'm still not likely to cry, but it's a little bit more like what they might experience in their home playing the game, for real.
But I absolutely, as I said, loved Edith Finch, and it did have a sort of emotional, each story is a very melancholic sort of happy sadness or sad happiness. I'm not sure which one, but, and it to me, it was a story that couldn't have been told in any other medium because of that connection that you have by playing the game. Books can obviously have an emotional effect, as can movies, but I think it is a very unique experience that you've created there.
Thanks. It's been odd to see that more people have experienced the game as YouTube videos than have actually played it. We designed it as something that was very much about how you were interacting with it and what you were doing as a player. And yet it also does work as something that you can be passively watching as a movie. It just, I think it's a very shallow version of that experience. So it's kind of strange to see that even though we never intended people to just watch it, that is how a lot of people have ultimately experienced it.
And I think, as you said, that the gameplay was the first step, and the story kind of came after that. And I have to say that I find that surprising. I assumed it would be the other way around almost, because the story had such an impact on me. And one of the ones that sticks in my head whenever I think of the game is Lewis's story, when he's chopping the fish with one hand, but at the same time he's also having this kind of imagination of what he's doing as this made up story. And as the player, with one stick you're chopping the fish, with another stick you're moving him through this world. And as the story goes on, the world takes over more and more of the real life. And the way that story ends, as Marco says, it's really melancholic. And I can't imagine that working in any other medium, or especially watching on YouTube. It was part of it. The reason it worked so well for me was because I was controlling the parts of it, both hands myself.
Yeah, and I think in that story in particular, the story is about distraction. Mm-hmm. And that's an experience that as a player, you can be very, intimately engaged with. Like it's somewhat ironic, that you're telling the story about distraction while the player is themselves, finding themselves distracted by the challenge of having these two sticks that you have to do at once and getting kind of lulled into the waking sleep that, games are pretty good at inducing. And so, yeah, it's nice to be able to kind of like, going back to this curling metaphor, take the force that is already kind of on the table and extant of the way that players are experiencing this thing, and then write a story that addresses that. And that's one of the great things about being a small studio and being able to make changes so frequently and up to the very end, that we can look at these stories and say, players are really, it's very easy to have them be distracted, which can be problematic in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. But in this case, it's like, rather than try to not make them distracted, what if we just tried to, emphasize that and then wrote a story that, tied back into that. And then, yeah, it's a nice end result that the stories end up feeling very tied together with the gameplay, which I guess you could do if you were a much better game developer than I am and wrote stories that just worked well and then implement the gameplay. But it also works the other direction of, having gameplay that is at some kind of, lizard brain level compelling, and then write the story that ties into and, makes a little bit more visible some of those emotions that are already in play. Like you're kind of dealing electricity that's already there. Yeah. You don't have to create it.
Yeah.
And in terms of the process with Sony, and do you have to go to them when you're developing a new game? This is my ignorance of the games industry, so forgive me. But do you have to go to them with a sort of idea for what the game is going to be, or do you have something working and say, look, this is the concept of the sort of game it is, we'll develop it from here, and you just proceed on that basis?
Yeah, I think every publisher-developer relationship is a little different. In this case, we had done a game with Sony prior to this, the Unfinished Swan, that had gone pretty well. And so we had a bit of flexibility. We had, I think, a 6-month kind of prototyping period as part of the contract, where we were given the freedom to develop, whatever we wanted. And then after 6 months, presented that to the higher ups at Sony for, kind of a thumbs up, thumbs down. Mm-hmm. And then after that, things were more or less steady, although in the end, we ended up moving to a different publisher for various reasons, Annapurna, who is funded the rest of Edith Finch. And I think in our case, because we're making games that are deliberately unusual, there hasn't been a lot of meddling on the part of the publisher, because they don't really know what we're doing. We don't know either. There's some amount of trust that we will figure it out. And we have periodic milestones, like usually every month or two, kind of check in, so things aren't going too far off the rails. But there is a lot of trust in a game like the kind that we make, because it looks pretty crappy for a long, long time. And I think it's true for a lot of games, that they don't really come together until all the pieces are there and you've made most of the mistakes that you're going to make. The biggest ones.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, what they've resulted in, of course, is two, I think both of them won BAFTAs, is that correct? I think, amongst other awards.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is pretty incredible. The BAFTA for Edith Finch, you were up against things like Zelda, is that right? And stuff like that. And you beat all of them, which is incredible. I mean, I think deserved, but must have been a shock.
I don't know. I have my doubts, but it's very nice to be nominated. I think my philosophy, having been on a number of award juries, including actually the BAFTA award for this past year for Game of the Year, is that the nominations, I think we're pretty good as a species at selecting 4 or 5 of the best in a given year. I don't think that we've figured out how to select the one best. That seems like it's much more of a crapshoot. But yeah, the nomination is nice to have. And I mean, the award's good too. It's just like, that feels much more like a random.
Yeah. And I suppose that's right. I mean, games, like films as well, but games especially are very different beasts, and they can appeal to different, you can love an action shooter and you can love What Remains of Edith Finch, but they're both games, but they're both telling a completely different experience and story.
Yeah, no, it's strange that we have only the one word right now to describe games that encompass such a broad range of emotional experiences, goals. It's like if we only had one word that referred to, televised sports and, Kurosawa movies, and, it's a very, very broad tent.
And you said at the start that when you first wanted to get into the writing industry, that the games were, the writing of the games was very much kind of the last part. Can you make this crappy bit a little bit better, please? And I think I totally agree with that. And I think looking back, when I played games when I was younger, if it wasn't like an RPG, there was no real need to have a good story, because it was never about the story.
And even some of the
RPGs were awful, yeah. And I think nowadays, especially with the rise of all the indie games, it definitely feels like the storytelling has taken a much larger focus than it ever was in the past. And is that because of these indie games and these smaller experiences that don't have to be $49.99, AAA games anymore?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's all kinds of reasons. The sort of broader cultural aspects are really important about who's playing these games and the conditions under which they are played. So if if you have 90 seconds to play the game and it costs $0.25 each time, that places some pretty sharp on what you can do. And I think the last 20 years or so, like a lot of the improvements that we've seen in story have been a result of a more diverse group of people making and playing the games. And in the past, I think a lot of it was motivated by the tastes of teenage boys. And, like if you look at the kinds of music, for example, that teenage boys are into, that's a pretty narrow range of what's possible musically. And the, musical tastes of teenage boys in the 1970s is, different from the musical tastes of teenage boys today, but it's still like a fairly narrow range. And similarly with games, like I think the games that the teenage boys are most drawn to, is somewhat narrow. And it's nice that we're not all making games for teenage boys anymore. And even teenage boys are playing a lot more variety too. I think that's one of the great things about having a more diverse group of developers and audiences, that, people are it's much easier to experiment and try things you might not necessarily like. And having smaller teams also makes it easier to make small bets on stuff. And a lot of that is, from an economic standpoint, driven, I think, by how much easier it is not just to make games, but to get games to people. Like 20 years ago, you would need to meet somebody, from a giant retailer like Walmart, or I don't know what the equivalent would be in England or anywhere else. And nowadays, you don't have to go through that kind of slog to get your game out there. It's much easier to, take these small bets and see if they work. And then you have something like, Untitled Goose Game or whatever that
absolutely
out of nowhere suddenly, and then people can discover it.
Yeah. You said at the very start that the reason that you wanted to get into, or your thought about writing games, was because of some experience, good experiences that you'd had with games when you were younger. What were the games, the sort of seminal games that influenced you when you were younger? Yeah,
I would say Super Mario Brothers was the first one that really seared itself into my consciousness when I was, I don't know, third grade or so. And The Legend of Zelda soon after that were pretty powerful experiences. Zelda 64 was another. And I think lately, maybe like Katamari, even though that's now 10 or 15 years ago. The game that I still think about a fair amount. Although, I find as a player less and less interested, even though there is in games, even though there's more variety now than there's ever been. For me personally, like what drives me is exploring and new experiences. And I'm not quite sure why video games seem so preoccupied with evoking nostalgia. There's so many players and developers who want to recreate the experience that they had in third grade playing Super Mario Brothers. And you can get games that look just like Super Mario Brothers, and that's a big part of the appeal, that they're, evoking this warm familiarity, and I would much rather, create something that was a little bit challenging, emotionally and cognitively.
I think that's right, and I think we are seeing that kind of nostalgia, and I see that almost across all of the mediums, because how many shows have come back, like the X-Files, Twin Peaks, and often they're pretty crap. They haven't stood the test of time, or they don't, or they're not. It's difficult to bring a show back that was so big 20 years later, and there does seem to be a real focus now on bringing back old stuff.
What do you think is driving that interest in nostalgia?
I mean, I wondered if it was something similar to what you said earlier, where it's the people who played these games when they were younger, growing up and just wanting to recreate the same games they played when they were younger. Because I can't imagine people who didn't play those games would want to create them now. I imagine they're trying to kind of capture that feeling they had as a kid, almost. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, Cuphead's an interesting example too, where it's a game that looks like a 1920s cartoon. It's layers of nostalgia that, I mean, the people that play it obviously are not nostalgic.
No, that's true.
But there's, I don't know, maybe people just want to retreat from the present day.
Yeah, I think that's maybe
a simpler time.
So are you able to say what's next for Giant Sparrow at all, or give us a clue?
Oh, I wish I knew. I mean, I've been a new game, but these things are so unknown in the beginning that for the first couple of years, it's one, I'm legally not allowed to say.
Sure.
I actually genuinely don't know. That's part of what is exciting, is this exploration of the feeling. I mean, I can talk about the feeling. This new game, the last game was about the sense of being overwhelmed. This new game is about the connection I feel watching a crow landing on a branch, and relationships between humans and urban wildlife. And I have no idea what that game is going to be, but that's the challenge now. And one of the nice synchronicities in all of this for me is that as a developer, the experience is actually fairly similar to what we're trying to create for the player, where you're going into this unknown place and trying to understand it a little more deeply. But still in the very early stages of that process on the new game.
And so what is the sort of gestation period for a game, or does it just vary depending on the game?
I think it varies. For a lot of games, it's 0. You're just taking a game that is fairly similar, like Super Mario Brothers or what have you, and then just doing your take on it. But for the games that we've made, they tend to take anywhere between, 4 to 5 years is fairly typical. And a lot of that is with a very small team early on, with like maybe 3 people, and then eventually it'll get up to 15 or so.
And your writing style seems to start from a place of finding an emotion or a feeling, and then expanding out from there. And that seems something that works very well for games. But would you ever want to try your hand at writing anything else again now, like a book or a script? It's
not high on my list. I think I don't have any ideas that feel like they would be a natural fit for those other mediums. I think I really enjoy the tactile nature of game development, where the game itself is kind of talking back to you at points. You're taking an idea and then trying it out and then seeing what happens and making adjustments. Potentially in the future, if I had an idea that seems really appropriate to another medium. Although I found that a lot of the ideas that my brain generates are dependent on whatever I happen to be thinking about lately. Like I used to write parody newspaper headlines when I was at The Onion, and my brain would just be sort of tossing out these parody newspaper headlines during the day, or in the shower or whatever. And it was kind of comforting and a little sad to find that as soon as I was no longer working there, my brain just stopped coming up with those sorts of ideas.
I'm sure it's still in there somewhere.
Right. If I needed to, if my life depended on it, somehow.
And I just want to ask one last question quickly about your next game, and you said that it was about the feeling of a crow landing on a branch, and so are you when you finish a project and you say to yourself, I'm ready for the next project, do you basically just kind of like try and experience the world and keep your eyes open and see something and think, that's made me feel something, I want to try and capture that?
Yeah, I think I keep my eyes open all of the time. So, I have this list, a bunch of different ideas that I might be interested in, and then just try to pay attention to what are the things that draw me the most, that I spend the most kind of idle time wondering about. So, in my off hours from Edith Finch, I was reading biology textbooks and, exploring things related to the natural world. And it felt like it would be a natural fit to make a game that put those interests front and center. Partly because when you're making something for 4 or 5 years, I think you have to have some pretty, deep interest in a subject to power that kind of, not only constant effort, but experience of failure, because so many of the ideas just don't go anywhere. That having something that I knew that I was really interested in and also did not understand but wanted to was. And in this case, also, one of the things that I've realized is that for me, the thing I enjoy most about the whole process is the chance to learn new things. And so I tried to make a game that would force me to learn a lot of new skills and new ways of seeing the world. So in the case of this next game, it's all about the way that animals move. And so the first thing I did after taking, like a break, like a bit of a vacation after Edith Finch was done, was to spend a year going to school studying animation. And so now I'm doing a lot of animation on this new game. And that's been really enlightening to just have a much better eye for the way that things move and the way that people's hips, are rotated as they walk down the street, and those kind of little details that feel like they could be a whole game, creating situations that encourage players to notice all of the wondrous little details that, I'm now seeing. But darned if I know how to make that game yet.
What was the last book that you read?
Ooh, the last book that I read. That's a great question. I think it was probably In Ghostly Japan by Lucifadio Hearn. It's a collection of Japanese ghost stories written by an American who moved to Japan in the 1890s.
All right.
And it's a really interesting, kind of several layers deep experience of foreignness. And it's a collection of ghost stories and also a small treatise on entomology, which is really appealing. I think this next game is going to have some of those elements weaved through it.
Cool. What was the last game that you played?
The last game that I played was Untitled Goose Game.
Nice. I have it on my Switch. I've not yet played it. I'm very excited to try it. I've just laughed watching every clip of it. So it's absolutely bizarre.
Yeah, no, I think they've really done a fantastic job at some things that we have historically struggled with, like particularly choosing a very unique but simple and evocative title and a premise that works very well, in a 1 second GIF.
Definitely. What was the last film you saw?
The last film I saw was the last documentary was Iso Takahata's Princess Kaguya? It was a documentary about the animated film and the production process.
All right.
The Studio Ghibli movie from 2013. And then the last fiction film was John Cassavetes' Opening Night.
Cool. So I think the very, very last thing we do is a quick fire, one or the other rapid question.
Yeah, so
there's no right or wrong answer, just purely one or the other. First one, I'll go first. Console or PC?
These days console.
A real book or an e-book?
I really like them both. I spent 6 months traveling, and I would not have wanted to carry all of those real books with me. Mm-hmm. But I think real book. I went to the library earlier this week, and for the first time, I got the response, are you going to take all of those today? Next time be able to carry that. I've gotten a lot of books for reference. So yeah, no, I really like physical books.
And the last one, TV or cinema?
Oh, cinema. That's an easy one.
Good.
So it's amazing how few people pick the cinema. I think folk like just lying on the sofa now, but I'm definitely a cinema fan, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I really love a lot of television shows, but I feel like the intensity is so much higher in movies, and that's more of what I'm looking for, these intense flashes from some new place.
Well, that was a little bit different, actually, wasn't it?
Yeah, no, it was, but I thought it was really interesting. Ian was a really engaging guy, I thought, to speak to. And just quite fascinating, the different approach that you have to have as a writer. You know, he in his case, he says not everyone does this, but in his case, he'll start with a game. Well, he'll start really with a sense or a feeling that he wants. And then he'll build gameplay around that. And then the story actually comes much later in the process.
It's all about trying to guide a player through a process to make them feel an emotion or a feeling, as he says. And that is a certainly a unique way of writing a story.
Yeah, I think even in the games industry, to be fair, it's quite a unique approach.
Absolutely, yeah.
And
because even the gameplay itself seems to come second. It is about that player emotion.
Yeah, and it must be such a challenge to do that. And you must, as he was saying, you can't really know if you've succeeded until you've got people in front of you playing it and testing it and seeing if it works. I mean, I thought it was really interesting that he said the playtesters, no one cried playing the game, but once people got it in their own homes, playing it on their own, there was that emotional connection.
Because the environment's so different when you're by yourself in your setting, bringing your own, your own memories, etc., to it, and everyone will probably get something a little bit different from it. I thought it was really interesting when he said that the writing process is so different for a game compared to, say, a book, in that you don't know where the readers will go next. You could write in a book. You write a scene, you write a second scene, and you know that they'll be read one after the other.
Unless it's a choose your own adventure.
Unless it's a choose your own adventure game.
But that in a way is a game, I suppose.
But exactly, but exactly right. You don't know for sure whether a player will go into that room. They just open the door to it, or whether they'll go back out to the garden again.
You can't say, right, I'm leading up to this massive climax of this moment in the game.
Yeah.
Because the player could just turn around and walk out the room again.
And you need to make sure that the story is strong enough to A, make the player want to go in a certain direction, but B, that the game it won't break if the player goes the wrong way.
But also it was interesting in that sense that they've learned over this time of creating these games, they know the sort of subliminal ways to guide a player,
the hints and cues,
so that most players will follow that path.
Because I've certainly played games in the past where I've been looking in the wrong place and I've heard something from behind me and I've turned around and I realise I've missed something. And that's the trick of a good game is to make sure players are always present for the story and they're always part of it without taking the control away. Yeah,
well, I mean, I hope you guys enjoyed that as much as we did speaking to Ian.
That was a really interesting
It was. We really appreciate Ian taking the time to speak to us during his cycle.
But it is a game that I would urge everyone to play because it is absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, even if games aren't your thing, check out What Remains of Edith Finch if you can.
It's only a couple of hours.
It's a couple of hours, but it is a very impactful experience, I think. So who's on next week, Tarek?
Next week we are chatting with Stuart Heritage, columnist?
A communist?
He's coming in from Russia. No, he's a columnist for The Guardian. And he's also written a couple of books, very funny books.
Oh, very funny books.
I've certainly laughed. Worried Stories for Bedtime Liberals is a fairy tale.
No, bedtime stories for
worried liberals. It was the opposite way around in Russia, the edition I read. It's a very short series of fairy tales in there. They're very funny.
Yeah, well, I read his first book, which is a sort of memoir about his life, but it kind of focuses on his brother, and it's called Don't Be a Dick, Pete. And it genuinely is one of the funniest books that I've read in a long time. It's rare, I think, to find a book that actually makes you physically laugh. You'll often have a wry smile or something, but there were a few moments in that book where I just burst out laughing. So it's a really good chat we had with Stuart.
Yeah, very, very fun.
Please do tune in for that one next week. As always, just to say thank you to Simon Stokes for his production assistance.
If anybody wants to get in touch with us, they can always send us a tweet to @right_gear or send us an email to podcast@rightgear.co.uk. And of course, you might want to get in touch with us because
we are still running the competition. As mentioned on last week's podcast, our interview with Andy McNabb, Andy was kind enough to sign a couple of his books, including his latest one, Whatever It Takes. And those are up for grabs in the competition, along with your very own page one notebook, which is the notebook that we've made to help you write and plan your own stories. The details of how to enter you can find on all of our social media feeds. There's different ways depending on whether you use Twitter, Facebook or Instagram. But as podcast listeners, you can also enter by rating us and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. If you do that, just drop us an email and let us know that you have done that so that we can be sure to enter you into the competition. But the reviews and the ratings, just as we've said before, it really helps our visibility on these things and helps the podcast stand out from what is a very wide field of podcasts. So we would really appreciate it if you did that, even if you don't want to win the books, but I would highly recommend you do. And with that, I think we'll just leave you with a bit more about page one, the writer's notebook that we've made, and we'll see you next week.
See you next week.
The blank page. To some, it's terrifying, an obstacle to overcome. But we prefer to think of it as an opportunity, a blank canvas to be filled with all of the adventures and characters in our head. So how to overcome that fear? Well, we all know the best advice for a writer is write. Seriously, Get words on the page and more will follow.
But what about later, when you start trying to pull those threads of what you've written together? What about the character you wrote about way back at the start? Who was she again? What was she carrying? And where did she leave the MacGuffin that she now really needs in the third act? Think about all those top thrillers you like to read, or that amazing drama you just watched. What did they all have in common? Structure and planning.
As aspiring writers ourselves, we've tried many different methods to try and organise all the thoughts about the stories we want to tell. We've been there searching for a piece of scrap paper to note something down, or making a quick note on our phone in between meetings.
Or sometimes we'll make a note in whatever notebook we're carrying, or a document on our laptop so we don't forget that great idea. Let's be honest, it can all be a bit messy and it's easy to lose track of everything. And that's when we realised it's not just the story that needs structure and planning, but the way we gather all of our thoughts about it as well.
And so we made Page One. Page One is more than just another notebook. It's a place to put down all your ideas for your latest project, divided into easy-to-use sections that will help you plan your story, so that when that blank page comes calling, you're ready to answer. And then afterwards, once it's written, we realised you need to plan how to let people read it, so we included a section relating to submissions.
Each one is designed for one project, whether you want to write a book, screenplay, a comic, or any other kind of story. We truly believe that when you use it, it will help you get to the main event, writing your story. So we hope this helps.
We can't wait to read what you come up with.
And remember, every story starts with page one.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, please leave a comment down below, hit that thumbs up button, and be sure to hit that subscribe button as well so you never miss an episode like these ones below.
And if you want to get in touch, you can always drop us a tweet in the Twitter machine, which is at UKPage1, as evidenced here, and our other social media channels are available.
Otherwise, we hope to see you next episode.
See you later.